One of the most frustrating things about learning to use your new camper can be unhitching and hitching to your tow vehicle. On this week's episode of Tab Talk, I've got 7 tricks that I've learned over the years that make hitching and unhitching a little less frustrating. Stay tuned. Since I took the Tab 360 prototype and I've been engaged with the Tab 360 Facebook group, what I've learned is that we have a whole bunch of new folks engaging with the Tab community because of this awesome new camper. So some of these things that I forget and take for granted came to mind as I started doing them with the 360. In some ways, it was almost like being a brand new camper owner again. Not because it was so different. I think just having a different camper made my mind walk through things differently, and I started seeing questions from people that I used to have. And so I thought this would be a great way to share some of these tips quickly for all the not only new 360 owners out there and nuCamp owners, but really these are pretty universal and should apply to anybody who has a bumper pull camper. On my recent trip, I've actually been on the road for close to 6 months, a little over 6 months, with the exception of a handful of nights that I stayed with friends. And I did a lot of hitching and unhitching, and I used to really dread it. It used to feel like so much effort to me, and it's partly because I would run into frustrations, whether it was getting the coupler centered over the ball or getting the coupler to release, getting the ball to release, and the less I had to do that, the less frustrated I was, the more enjoyable the experience. But when I started camping a lot, I learned a lot. And it came from just doing it over and over and over. So today, I'm going to share sort of the 7 things I really think have been helpful to me when it comes to hitching and unhitching from my tow vehicle. So without further ado, let's jump right into those 7 tips. Now, in case you didn't know it, the coupler needs to close completely. If it's only closing partly, you probably are lacking alignment somewhere. So when I first started camping, I tried to get the coupler, the center of the coupler, directly over the tow ball. And I found that to be problematic. The coupler wouldn't latch completely. What I learned was that in order to get it really where you need to for that coupler to rest, you actually start with the coupler just slightly behind the tow ball. It's still mostly over it, but there's a little bit of room for it to move forward. You'll see when you lower the jack, it generally slightly, very slightly moves forward. The next tip I see a lot, and it usually results in people using profanity or tools to try to help them. I've seen big screwdrivers or hammers. If you're resorting to tools, you are not doing it correctly. The problem is gravity, and it might be ever so slight slope. It might be the position of the tow vehicle and the camper in the campsite that's creating that. Whatever it is, you've got to use physics to resolve it. So there are a couple things I do to help with that. The first and easiest is just put a little weight on the camper, push it back a little bit, and you might be thinking, I'm not strong enough. It really doesn't take that much force in a lot of cases to be able to release the coupler. For more severe instances, I will actually chalk the tires on the camper, both front and back, and just pull forward. And by forward, I mean inches with the tow vehicle. What that does is it releases the pressure that's forward onto the hitch. That's the key with releasing the coupler. If you've got weight leaning forward onto the tow vehicle or the hitch, then it's going to create this pressure because the campers still, even though these are lightweight campers, there's still some weight, and you need to release that pressure so that the coupler can open easily. And while we're on gravity, let's move to the next tip. That's about the Anderson leveler. I see people back onto the Anderson leveler, and when you back onto the Anderson leveler, you're putting weight forward onto the hitch. The Anderson leveler is meant to be pulled onto. I made this mistake for a couple years after I started using the Anderson leveler, and for some reason I thought, why don't I go watch an Anderson leveler instructional video from Anderson. And I did, and they pointed out that the Anderson leveler is meant to be driven onto. When you do that, it raises it in such a way the weight is not forward, it's back if anywhere. Now, if you have a 320 without a boondock axle, there may not be room to pull forward onto the Anderson because the step is so close. If that's the case, you'll want to use a different method of leveling. No matter what you do, when you're using the Anderson, you're going to have the weight forward if you back onto it versus pull forward onto it. When you first get your camper, your dealer may do this for you, but they may not, and you may need to do it more than once. And that is lubricate the coupler. You'll want to use a dry lubricant, and there are a variety that you can use. I've used white lithium grease, the dry version. I've used graphite dry. They're spray cans. Recently, I've started using T9 Bow Shield, and I find that works very well. WD-40 is actually not a lubricant, but it's great at cleaning it. So before you lubricate it, go ahead and use your WD-40, but know that you're just using it to clean it, not to lubricate it. The next tip is for people who have some type of auto leveling or air suspension that they're using in their tow vehicle. And I love having auto leveling and air suspension. It makes for a great towing experience. Mine even has some sway dampening. But what I didn't realize for the longest time is that if I close the door, it's going to auto level to the park level. And that actually was making it more difficult to release the coupler or to release the ball in some cases. So if you have a tow vehicle with those features, figure out when yours engages. If I leave my driver door open, the auto leveling won't change. So that's something I know, and it helps just make things a little easier. The next tip actually comes to, what if I've been able to release the coupler, but when I'm jacking up the coupler off the ball actually won't release from the coupler. Again, this is something I've experienced with air suspension. What I've learned is that if I engage the brake, so if I put my foot on the brake or use the emergency brake and put the car into drive, it actually releases the ball. I don't know what's going on, but that has worked for me and saved me a ton of frustration. Lastly, most people are going to want to lubricate their tow balls. Again, if you're new, you may not know that. You can get tow ball grease at a lot of places that sell hitches and couplers. There are several brands. I've never had to use one. I use a greaseless tow ball, which are very difficult to find. I've really had to put some effort in it, but that's all I've ever used. And that has a hard rubber cap. If you can find them, they're great. If not, a regular ball is just fine. Just make sure that you grease it. So I hope those 7 tips make sense to you, and at least 1 or 2 make your hitching and unhitching process a little easier. The one thing I've learned over the years, whether it's hitching and unhitching, backing in your camper, is that experience makes a lot of difference. I used to be somebody who traveled once a year, did a 2 or 3 week trip, but I didn't camp throughout the year. And so I'd forget everything I learned. If you really want to get good at this stuff, the best way is to do it over and over and over. Talk to other folks at the campground, whether they're tab owners or not, and you're going to learn a lot. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.